Namaste, dear friends. Take a deep breath and settle into this moment. Have you ever found yourself pouring endlessly into others? Your time, your kindness, your energy, only to feel unseen, unappreciated, and quietly exhausted? You give, hoping for connection, yet deep down you wonder, where is the peace? We've been taught that kindness opens doors, that being liked means belonging. But what if this belief is keeping us trapped? What if true peace isn't found in giving more, but in giving wisely? Buddhism teaches that compassion is not self-sacrifice, but balance. That to truly love others, we must first honor ourselves. So today, let's explore a different path. One where kindness has boundaries, where no is an act of wisdom, and where self-respect is the key to genuine connection. If this resonates with you, stay with me. Let's walk this path together. There was a time when I thought kindness was a currency. One that, if spent generously enough, would buy me love, belonging, and acceptance. Smile at everyone. Say yes to every request. Be endlessly available. And in return, I believed people would value me. I would be seen, appreciated, cared for. But life has a way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn willingly. I remember a particular evening, not too long ago, when exhaustion wrapped itself around me like a heavy, invisible cloak. I had spent the entire day helping, a friend who needed a ride, a colleague who needed just a quick favor, a relative who called to vent for an hour about the same problem they never intended to fix. My phone battery was nearly dead, but I felt even more drained than the device in my hand. I sat in my car outside my apartment, too tired to even step inside. And for the first time in a long time, a quiet, undeniable thought surfaced in my mind. No one ever asks if I need anything. The realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Like suddenly noticing you've been carrying a heavy bag for miles without once stopping to check if you really needed everything inside it. I had mistaken being liked for being valued. And in doing so, I had poured myself into everyone around me without once considering if I was being refilled. Buddhism speaks often of suffering, how it is not merely pain, but the result of attachment. And one of the most insidious attachments we carry is our need for approval. From the moment we are children, we learn that being agreeable brings rewards. A smiling child is praised, a helpful friend is welcomed, an employee who never complains is favored. So we mold ourselves into the shape others expect, hoping that in doing so, we will be loved. But here's the truth we rarely pause to consider. Love given out of exhaustion is not love at all. It is sacrifice. There's an old Buddhist story that perfectly illustrates this. Imagine a great river flowing freely across the land. It nourishes trees, animals, and people along its way, bringing life wherever it touches. But one day, the river reaches a vast desert. It does not pause to consider. It simply continues to give, pouring its waters into the barren land. Yet no matter how much it offers, the desert remains dry. The sun drinks up every drop before it can soak into the soil. The river, once full of life, begins to wither. And then finally it stops, empty, depleted. Like this river, we pour our energy into places that cannot hold it. We say yes to people who take without giving. We bend ourselves to accommodate others, hoping they will one day do the same for us. But some people are deserts. They will take everything you give, not out of malice, but because that is their nature. And so, the real question is not, why don't they appreciate me? But rather, why do I keep giving to those who cannot receive? I used to believe that being needed was the same as being loved. That if I just did more, gave more, people would naturally return the kindness. But I was wrong. Love, respect, appreciation. These things do not grow in the barren soil of one-sided relationships. They grow where there is balance, where kindness flows in both directions. But how do we know when to stop? It begins with a pause, a single breath before answering, a moment of reflection before saying yes. When someone asks for your time, your energy, your effort, ask yourself, am I giving because I truly want to? Or am I giving because I'm afraid? Afraid of disappointing them? Afraid of being seen as selfish? afraid that if I stop giving, they will stop valuing me. Because if your kindness is fueled by fear, then it is not kindness at all, it is self-abandonment. I wish I could tell you that the moment I realized this, I changed overnight, that I started setting boundaries effortlessly, that I never felt guilty for saying no, that I never again poured my energy into the wrong people. But that would be a lie. Growth is rarely instant. There were times I still overextended myself, times I agreed to things out of habit. But there were also moments of quiet victory. Times I took a deep breath and said, I can't right now, and felt the world continue spinning. Times I let a phone call go to voicemail without feeling the need to justify why I couldn't answer. Times I chose myself, not because I was angry or resentful, but because I finally understood. My energy is sacred. My kindness is a gift, not a debt. And do you know what happened? The right people remained. The ones who truly valued me never needed me to sacrifice myself for them. They respected my time, honored my boundaries, and understood that real love does not require exhaustion. And the ones who disappeared, they were the deserts. The ones who only valued me when I was useful to them. Let them go. Let them fade like footprints in the sand. Because at the end of the day, you are not here to be drained. You are not here to be endlessly available at the cost of your own well-being. You are not a river meant to run dry. You are here to live, to breathe, to give freely, but only in places where your kindness can take root and flourish. So the next time you feel that familiar tug, the one that says, say yes, be agreeable, don't disappoint them, pause. Ask yourself, is this a fertile field? Or is this a desert? And then choose wisely. There was a time when I believed that kindness meant always saying yes. That to be a good person, I had to be endlessly available, always there when someone needed me, always willing to help. It didn't matter if I was tired, overwhelmed, or had my own responsibilities. If someone asked, I gave. If someone needed, I provided. If someone expected, I delivered. And yet, the more I gave, the less I felt seen. The more available I was, the more invisible I became. It wasn't that people were unkind or ungrateful. No, it was more subtle than that. It was as if my willingness to always be there made me expected. Like a tree that provides shade in the summer, comforting, useful, but rarely noticed until the day it is gone. I remember one particular evening, the kind of evening that settles over you like a heavy blanket, thick, quiet, full of unspoken exhaustion. I had just finished another long day of doing things for others. Running errands for a friend, covering a shift for a coworker, answering messages I didn't have the energy for. And as I sat alone, sipping a now cold cup of tea, a thought surfaced so clearly it felt like someone else had whispered it to me. When was the last time someone did something for me? I searched my memory, but instead of finding an answer, I found an even deeper realization. When was the last time I allowed someone to? That was the moment I understood something fundamental. It wasn't that people took me for granted. It was that I had never taught them to do otherwise. Buddhism speaks of equanimity not as indifference but as balance. A river does not flow endlessly in one direction without eventually running dry. A tree does not bend for every passing wind without breaking. And yet, how often do we ignore this truth in our own lives? How often do we believe that to be good, to be loved, we must give without limit? I once heard a story from a Buddhist monk that changed the way I thought about kindness. He spoke of a great tree standing in the heart of a dense forest. It had been there for hundreds of years, its roots deep, its branches wide. Travelers rested in its shade, birds nested in its limbs, and the forest around it flourished because of the shelter it provided. But this tree did not bend for every request. When the wind blew, it swayed, but it did not uproot itself for the sake of others. When travelers came, it offered shade, but it did not break itself apart to build their shelters. The tree remained standing, not because it refused to give, but because it understood that true giving is sustainable giving. That to continue offering, it must also preserve itself. This is the art of boundaries. We often mistake boundaries for walls, as if saying no is an act of rejection rather than an act of self-respect. But Buddhism teaches us that wisdom is knowing when to give and when to hold back. that generosity does not mean self-sacrifice, that we can be kind without being depleted. I had to learn this the hard way. At first, saying no felt foreign on my tongue, like an unfamiliar language I was just beginning to understand. I felt guilty. I felt selfish. I worried that people would be disappointed in me. But then something unexpected happened. The right people stayed, and the wrong ones faded. It wasn't immediate, but over time, I noticed a shift. The ones who had only valued me for what I could do for them slowly disappeared. But those who truly cared, they respected my space. They understood my limits. And some even began offering the same care to me in return. I wish someone had told me sooner that not everyone deserves unlimited access to you. That your time is precious, your energy is finite, and your kindness is a gift, not an obligation. I wish someone had told me that setting boundaries doesn't push away the right people. It reveals them. I remember the first time I told a friend, "I can't help with that today." My heart raced as I waited for disappointment, for frustration. But instead, they simply said, "That's okay." And just like that, I realized that my fear had been unfounded. That the people who truly matter don't demand more than you can give. They cherish what you do offer. Buddhism teaches that balance is the key to peace. If we do not respect our own limits, how can we expect others to? If we do not honor our own needs, how can we truly give without resentment? I had spent so long fearing that setting boundaries would make me lose people. But in the end, the only thing I lost was my own exhaustion. So now, when someone asks for my time, my energy, my presence, I pause. I ask myself, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom. Is this a gift I can give freely, or am I giving out of fear? If I can give with love, I do. But if I feel drained, if I feel unseen, if I feel like the river flowing into the desert, I remind myself of the tree in the forest. Strong, steady, offering but never uprooting itself for the sake of another. And I say no, with kindness, with grace, without guilt, because I have learned that true generosity does not empty you. It nourishes you, too. I used to apologize for everything. I'd say sorry when someone bumped into me. I'd say sorry if I spoke too loudly, if I asked a question, if I took up space in a crowded room. I even caught myself apologizing to inanimate objects. "Oh, sorry," I'd mumble after accidentally brushing against a table or stepping on a creaky floorboard. At first, it seemed harmless, just a little verbal tick. But over time, I started to notice something unsettling. The more I apologized, the smaller I felt. My words, my presence, even my own needs. Everything felt like something to be excused, something to apologize for. One afternoon, I met an old friend for tea. As I slid into my seat, I blurted out my usual, "Sorry I'm late," even though I was only 2 minutes past the hour. My friend smiled and said something that caught me off guard. "You know," she said, stirring her tea, "you say sorry a lot. Have you ever noticed?" I laughed, brushing it off.
"Och, igesido."
She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "Why?" I opened my mouth to respond but found that I had no answer. Why did I say sorry so much? I carried that question with me for days, turning it over like a pebble in my hand. And then, slowly, the truth began to surface. I apologized because, deep down, I believed I was an inconvenience. I apologized because I was afraid of taking up too much space, of being too much, of making others uncomfortable. I apologized because, somewhere along the way, I had learned that my presence needed to be softened, that my voice needed to be smaller, that my needs should never impose on anyone else. But here's the thing, existence is not something to apologize for. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment. Attachment to ideas, to expectations, to the need for approval. And for many of us, one of the deepest attachments we carry is the belief that we must earn our place in the world. That we must be easy, agreeable, uncontroversial. That we must never disrupt, never burden, never be anything other than perfectly accommodating. But the Buddha also taught that true peace comes from understanding our own worth. There's a famous story in Buddhist teachings about a monk who was insulted in the marketplace. A man, filled with anger, hurled words meant to wound, to provoke. But the monk simply stood there, serene, unmoved. When asked why he did not defend himself, why he did not react, the monk smiled gently and said, "If someone offers you a gift, but you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" This story stayed with me for a long time. Just as we do not have to accept insults, we do not have to apologize for simply being. I started paying attention to my words, catching myself before the automatic "sorry" could slip out. At first, it felt strange, like breaking an old habit. But over time, I replaced those apologies with something different, something that did not shrink me. Instead of "sorry I'm late," I said, "Thank you for waiting." Instead of "sorry to bother you," I said, "Do you have a moment?" Instead of "sorry, can I ask something?" I simply asked, and something changed. I started feeling more present in my own life. My words felt stronger, my presence more solid. I no longer carried the weight of constant self-erasure. But the most surprising thing, no one minded. The world did not crumble when I stopped apologizing for every little thing. No one thought I was rude or inconsiderate. In fact, the people who truly cared, the ones who valued me, began responding differently. They listened more closely. They took my words more seriously. Because when we stop apologizing for existing, we teach others to respect our presence, too. One day, not long after I had started changing this habit, I was walking down a busy street when someone bumped into me. Hard. My old instinct kicked in, and the word almost escaped my lips. "Sorry." But then I stopped myself. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't caused harm. I hadn't been in the wrong place. So instead, I simply stepped aside and kept walking. And just like that, I realized I had given up something that had never belonged to me in the first place. The burden of unnecessary guilt. It takes time to unlearn the habit of over-apologizing. But here's what I've found. Every time you choose not to apologize unnecessarily, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Every time you speak with confidence instead of self-doubt, you stand a little taller. Every time you acknowledge your own worth, the world takes notice. And in doing so, you begin to live not as an apology but as a presence. There was a time when I couldn't say no. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of seeming selfish. Afraid that if I stopped saying yes, if I stopped being available, people would stop valuing me. It's strange, isn't it? How we convince ourselves that our worth is tied to how much we do for others. That the more we give, the more we are loved. But love, real love, does not demand that we exhaust ourselves. I learned this the hard way. One evening, after a particularly long day, my phone buzzed with a message from a friend. She needed a favor. Nothing big, just a little something. I looked at the screen, at the words glowing softly in the dim light of my living room. I could feel the familiar response rising in me. Of course, I can help. But then, something inside me hesitated. I was tired, really tired. The kind of tired that settles deep into your bones, making even the smallest request feel like climbing a mountain. And yet, even in that exhaustion, I felt the pull to say yes. Because what if she got upset? What if she thought I didn't care? What if she stopped asking altogether? I stared at my phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard, when I suddenly remembered a story I once heard about a wise monk who lived in the mountains. Many people came to him for guidance, and he welcomed them with kindness. But one day, after listening to a visitor's concerns for hours, the monk gently shook his head and said, "I cannot help you anymore today." The visitor was taken aback. "But I need you. I've come all this way." The monk smiled. "By saying no, I give you the gift of space. You will find your own answers." When I first heard this story, I didn't quite understand it. A gift? How could saying no be a gift? But as I sat there, phone still in hand, something clicked. Saying no was not rejection. It was respect. Respect for my own time. Respect for my own energy. And most importantly, respect for the fact that I, too, deserved care. So, for the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath and typed out a different response. "I'd love to help, but I can't today. I hope you understand." I pressed send before I could second-guess myself. And do you know what happened? Nothing. The world did not end. My friend did not get angry. She simply replied, "Of course. Take care of yourself." I sat there, staring at the message, realizing how much unnecessary weight I had been carrying. How many times had I assumed that saying no would make people love me less, when in reality, the people who truly cared never expected me to give more than I could. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. And one of the attachments we struggle with most is our need for approval. We say yes because we want to be good, kind, helpful. We say yes because we fear that if we don't, we will lose something: friendship, respect, belonging. But true connection does not come from self-sacrifice. It comes from balance, from knowing when to give and when to hold back, from understanding that our time, our energy, our well-being, they matter too. I used to think that setting boundaries would push people away. But what I've learned is this: the right people will respect them, and the wrong people, they will leave. And that's okay. Now, when someone asks for something, I pause. I check in with myself. Do I have the energy to do this? Am I saying yes because I want to, or because I feel like I should? If I can give freely without resentment, I say yes. But if my body, my mind, my heart tells me otherwise, I give myself permission to say no. Not with guilt, not with fear, but with love. For myself, and for those who will understand. I understand exactly what you're looking for. Part 5 should seamlessly weave together compassion and wisdom, showing how they complement the lessons on boundaries, mindful giving, and self-respect. It should feel like a natural conclusion, offering a Buddhist perspective on kindness that is both heart-centered and wise. The storytelling should remain warm, reflective, and deeply engaging, like a quiet conversation over tea, full of insight yet soothing in its delivery. Here's part 5, expanded in that spirit. There was a time when I believed that being a good person meant always putting others first. That kindness meant giving without question, sacrificing without hesitation, and saying yes even when my heart whispered no. I carried this belief for years, wearing it like a badge of honor. I thought it made me selfless. I thought it made me strong. But one day something changed. I was speaking to a Buddhist teacher, sharing my exhaustion, my quiet resentment, my endless need to give. I expected him to nod in approval, to reassure me that I was on the right path. Instead, he smiled gently and asked me a question that has never left me. If a mother bird gives all her food to her chicks but does not eat herself, what happens? I hesitated. She grows weak. He nodded. And then, she can no longer care for them, I admitted. His eyes softened. Compassion without wisdom is like that mother bird. It gives until there is nothing left. But true compassion, real, balanced compassion, knows that to care for others, we must also care for ourselves. That was the first time I truly understood the union of compassion and wisdom. Buddhism teaches that compassion, karu, and wisdom, prajna, must go hand in hand. Like two wings of a bird, they must work together. One without the other will only lead to imbalance. Too much compassion without wisdom, we deplete ourselves, give beyond our capacity, and suffer in silence. Too much wisdom without compassion, we become cold, distant, calculating. Our boundaries turn into walls, our self-respect into isolation. But when these two qualities flow together, we learn the art of mindful kindness. A kindness that is not exhausting, not draining, but sustainable. A kindness that nurtures both the giver and the receiver. I used to think that setting boundaries made me less kind. But now I understand boundaries are an act of love. When we say no, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom, we give others the space to grow. We stop enabling toxic dynamics. We stop overextending ourselves to people who only take. When we stop apologizing for existing, we teach others to value our presence. When we learn to give mindfully, rather than endlessly, our kindness becomes something real, something powerful, something that actually makes a difference. A river that nourishes wisely does not waste itself in the desert. A tree that stands firm provides shade without falling. A monk who knows when to say no gives the greatest gift of all, self-respect. And so, the next time you feel guilty for saying no, remember this: Compassion is not self-sacrifice. Compassion is wise, and wisdom is kind. The moment you find this balance, you will begin to give, not from obligation, not from fear, but from a place of true love. For yourself, and for others. I want you to imagine something. Picture a candle burning in the quiet of a darkened room. Its flame flickers gently, steady yet fragile, giving off warmth and light to everything around it. Now imagine someone comes along and asks for some of its flame to light their own candle. The candle offers its fire without hesitation, and a second light appears. Another person comes, then another, each lighting their own wick from the original flame. At first, this seems like a beautiful act of generosity. The candle is giving freely, spreading light. But what happens when too many take from it? What happens when it burns itself down to nothing? It disappears. It gives until there is nothing left. And then the room is dark once more. This is the nature of compassion without wisdom. We give until we have nothing left for ourselves. Until we are exhausted, depleted, barely holding on. We mistake kindness for self-erasure, mistaking self-sacrifice for love. But here is what Buddhism teaches us. True compassion does not burn itself out. True compassion is sustainable, balanced, and wise. This is why wisdom and compassion must walk hand in hand. One without the other leads to suffering, either for ourselves or for those we are trying to help. There's a story from the Buddha's life that illustrates this so well. One day, a young monk came to the Buddha, weary and exhausted. He had spent months caring for others in the monastery, fetching water, cooking meals, tending to the sick. He worked tirelessly, always the first to rise and the last to sleep. Yet despite his efforts, he felt something wasn't right. He was irritable, fatigued, even resentful at times. And so he asked the Buddha, "Master, why do I feel so empty when I have given so much?" The Buddha smiled gently and said, "If a man crosses a river with a small boat and picks up too many passengers, what happens?" The monk frowned. "The boat sinks." The Buddha nodded. "So too with compassion. If you carry too much without balance, you will sink beneath the weight of it. Compassion must be guided by wisdom, just as a boat must know its limits." This was the lesson I had never been taught, the lesson I wish I had learned sooner. For years, I believed that love meant selflessness, that the more I gave, the more worthy I became, that being a good person meant never turning anyone away, never prioritizing my own needs, never saying no. But I had misunderstood. Selflessness, when misunderstood, becomes self-neglect. And self-neglect is not noble. It is not kind. It does not make us more virtuous, more loving, or more enlightened. In truth, it only makes us weaker. Because how can we truly show up for others if we are running on empty? How can we give genuine kindness when we are exhausted, drained, and resentful? Buddhism teaches that true compassion begins within. Think of a lotus flower floating on the surface of a still pond. Its petals open to the morning sun, its roots anchored deep in the mud below. The lotus is beautiful because it is nourished. It has what it needs to thrive. Now imagine if that same lotus were constantly uprooting itself, trying to give all its nutrients to the other plants around it. Imagine it stretching itself thin, giving so much that its own petals begin to wilt. That is what happens when we give without boundaries. A tree does not give all its water away to the surrounding plants. It takes what it needs to stay strong, so that it can continue to provide shade and shelter. A river does not flow endlessly into the desert. It directs its waters where they will nourish life. The Buddha himself never taught limitless giving. Instead, he taught skillful giving, knowing when to help, how much to offer, and when to step back. Because sometimes, stepping back is the most compassionate thing we can do. I once had a friend who was always in trouble. She would call late at night with problems, always needing help, always needing someone to listen. And I was always there, picking up the phone, offering advice, rearranging my plans to support her. But no matter how much I gave, nothing changed. I felt obligated. I felt like I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I also felt something else. exhaustion, frustration, a quiet anger I didn't want to acknowledge. And then one day I didn't pick up the phone. Not because I didn't care, not because I wanted to abandon her, but because I realized something important. My help was no longer helping. She didn't need another late-night conversation. She needed to face things on her own, and I needed rest. When I finally spoke to her again, something surprising happened. She had solved the problem on her own. By not always being available, by stepping back, I had given her something far more valuable than my time. I had given her the space to grow. This is wisdom. This is compassion with boundaries. It took me a long time to understand that love is not measured by how much we sacrifice. True love, whether for a friend, a family member, or even ourselves, is measured by how skillfully we give. A mother does not feed her child by starving herself. A teacher does not enlighten students by staying silent. A candle does not give light by burning itself to nothing. You do not have to deplete yourself to be kind. You do not have to say yes to be worthy of love. You do not have to be everything for everyone to be enough. So the next time you feel guilty for saying no, for taking a step back, for choosing yourself, remember this: you are not a bottomless well. You are not here to pour endlessly until you are empty. You are here to shine, to love, and to live with both compassion and wisdom. And in that balance, you will find peace. I want you to imagine a quiet temple, nestled in the heart of a lush forest. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of incense and damp earth. In the courtyard, a young monk sits with his teacher, both watching the gentle ripples on a lotus pond. The old monk, wise and serene, finally speaks. "Tell me," he asks the younger one, "if someone comes to you with a heavy burden, should you carry it for them?" The young monk, eager to prove his understanding of kindness, nods without hesitation. "Of course, master. If I can ease their suffering, I must." The old monk smiles, dipping a hand into the water. He lifts a single droplet and lets it fall back into the pond. "And if another person comes, I will carry their burden too," the young monk replies. "And another? And another." The young monk hesitates now. The old monk simply looks at him. "At what point, my dear student, does your kindness become your suffering?" The young monk lowers his gaze, thinking deeply. This is the paradox of compassion. We want to help. We want to be kind. But if we take on too much, we become the ones who suffer. In Buddhism, there is a teaching called the middle way, the path between extremes. It is neither indulgence nor complete self-denial. It is balance. It is wisdom. It is knowing when to give and when to step back. There is a misconception that kindness means sacrificing ourselves completely, that to be compassionate means we must say yes to everyone, to be available at all times, to always carry the burdens of others. But Buddhism teaches us otherwise. True compassion is not about taking all the weight from someone's shoulders. It is about helping them learn how to carry it themselves. A good teacher does not simply give answers. He guides his student to find them. A good parent does not shield their child from all hardships. They teach them how to navigate life. A good friend does not solve every problem for another. They stand beside them as they figure it out. There was a time when I thought love meant doing everything for someone. I would overextend myself, thinking that if I just did a little more, gave a little more, things would be better. I believed that if I wasn't always available, I would be letting people down. But here's what I've learned. When we give too much, we take away someone else's chance to grow. When we say yes out of guilt, we invite resentment into our hearts. When we never allow ourselves to rest, we become too exhausted to truly show up for those we care about. Buddhism teaches us that intention matters. Giving with love is beautiful. But if we give out of obligation, out of fear, out of guilt, that giving is not pure. It drains us, creates suffering, not only for ourselves but for those around us. Have you ever noticed that when you are tired, even the smallest request feels overwhelming? That is because you cannot pour from an empty cup. This is why boundaries are not just necessary. They are an act of wisdom and love. Imagine if the sun never set, if it burned across the sky endlessly, never resting, never dimming. Would we call that kindness? Would we say, "Ah yes, the sun is so compassionate, It never takes a break. No, we would call it unnatural, unsustainable, and in the end, even the sun would burn itself out. Everything in nature follows a rhythm, a time to give and a time to rest. The tides move in and out. The trees shed their leaves in autumn and bloom again in spring. Even the Buddha himself took time for solitude, withdrawing into meditation before returning to teach. So why do we, as humans, believe we must always be available? There is wisdom in pausing, in knowing that you do not have to answer every call, respond to every request, or solve every problem. In understanding that your time, your energy, your presence, they are sacred. When you say no, you are not rejecting someone. You are honoring yourself. When you set a boundary, you are not withholding love. You are ensuring that the love you give is pure, intentional, and sustainable. There is great compassion in telling someone, "I cannot carry this for you, but I believe in your strength to carry it yourself." There is deep wisdom in knowing that when you protect your own peace, you are able to show up fully, joyfully, and with true generosity when it truly matters. So ask yourself, are you giving because you want to, or because you feel like you have to? Are you helping in a way that truly serves others? Or are you carrying burdens that do not belong to you? And most importantly, when was the last time you gave yourself the same kindness that you so freely offer to everyone else? Because in the end, the greatest lesson of all is this: compassion begins with you. Imagine standing by a great river, watching the water flow. Some streams nourish fertile land, bringing life and growth. Others spill into barren deserts, disappearing into the heat. Where is your energy flowing? Into places that appreciate and reciprocate, or into those that leave you empty? Buddhism reminds us, we are not here to be endlessly available. We are here to be present, intentional, and wise. True kindness does not mean saying yes to everything. It means knowing when to step back, when to protect our peace, and when to let go. So I leave you with this: what will you choose today? Will you continue giving until you are empty? Or will you begin to honor your time, your boundaries, and your worth? If this teaching spoke to you, share your thoughts below. Your journey matters. And if you wish to walk this path of wisdom together, join our community. Subscribe, reflect, and let's continue discovering the beauty of a balanced life. Until next time, may you be at peace.